Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on another presentation hosted by the Stellenbosch Psychology Department. I would like to let everyone know that the session is being recorded in order for it to be uploaded afterwards on our YouTube channel. I'd also like to ask if everyone could please reserve their comments and questions for the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Itumeleng Khumalo. He is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Johannesburg and an HPCSA registered clinical psychologist. Previously, he worked at the University of Free State and Northwest University. His PhD was on the measurement of psychological well-being and positive mental health. Presently, his research interest is in cross-cultural and cultural studies of psychological well-being in Africa, through which he hopes to contribute to understanding and promoting individual and community well-being in an African context. He has authored and co-authored several journal articles and book chapters, and co-edited a teaching textbook on positive psychology. Today, he will be presenting on positive mental health and beyond towards a contextually relevant study of well-being in Africa. I would like to hand over to Dr. Khumalo to take it away.
A very good afternoon, Sheena and colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation by the Department of Psychology at Stellenbosch. Let me start off by sharing the presentation here, and then we can then talk about it. We should be able to see it. Not yet.
Not yet, Itumeleng. I can't see it as yet.
We are sharing something else.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Right. All right. So let's get into it. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. So I'll try for the next 40 minutes or so to share some of these thoughts that we have, as well as some indication from the work that we're presently doing. What I would like us to come out of here with really is some thoughts about what a contextually relevant study of well-being may look like in Africa. So I present really two main purposes. One is to really pose some questions and encourage thoughts about what the future avenues of a field that may be emerging out of what we currently know as positive psychology, but when it sits in a dispensation that is post-disciplinary, what may this then look like? So we then are faced with the question of, is this perhaps the end of positive psychology as we have come to know it? And metaphors such as waves, gardens, and butterflies have been used. Against that background, the two objectives really would be, first, I use an empirical study to show how we have used measurements and psychometric approaches to demarcate or delineate between positive mental health and illness and show the coexistence of the two as two separate yet related spectrum. In the second, I want to then talk about what I have called an incomplete thesis. In this, I just share my thoughts and would actually like to hear what you think of what well-being studies ought to then look like, especially with an African context in mind in the future. all of this is really in response or as part of the invitation made by Wissing in 2002. She writes in this, what I think will become a seminal paper published in the Frontiers in Psychology, where she invites the rest, what she calls butterfly spotters, to explore this question in greater depth. And the question would really be that if we have, as she phrases it, the Garden of Well-being studies, and the field emerges as a butterfly out of a cocoon, what may this be? What may this butterfly, may this new field look like and seek to do? So I'll be responding to these somewhat with what I call an incomplete thesis, meaning that those are preliminary thoughts for which I would like to have a discussion with you about. But first, let's sort out this issue of the empirical study. There's a study on measuring positive mental health and depression in Africa. And I present in this slide the structure that I will follow in this regard. This is a submitted paper by myself, Richard Appiah, and Angelina Wilson-Fadiji. It comes from a project that we had earlier written. So who do we have in this study? Our participants were just under 900 students who came from 4 different countries. For the purposes of this particular study, they completed the mental health continuum as well as the patient health questionnaire. The aim of the study was really to investigate the operationalization of the dual continuum model of mental health. And we used the confirmatory factor analysis as well as the latent class analysis for this purpose. Now, against what theoretical background are we doing this? The argument really is that the promotion of mental health ought to be a separate endeavor to the treatment of mental illness, such that the two, mental illness as well as mental health, although related, are not polar opposites, but two continua that are parallel and sometimes interacting with each other. We then sought to use psychometric or measurement approaches as an operationalization to demonstrate precisely this. Previous studies have found that there are 4 possible groups that may emerge when one considers the continuum of mental health and then the continuum of mental illness. From this, we can see the 4 groups that have emerged from Sauder's studies. And here we see the 6 possible groups that have emerged from the studies of Colloquium. Now, what did we then find in our own study of just under 900 students from 4 different countries in Africa? We indeed found that the mental health continuum continues to give us the 3-factor structure, which is theoretically intended and would have been expected. And those are relational, rather emotional well-being, psychological well-being, and social well-being. So there are no surprises here, really, except for the modification indices, which I will not go into at present. And depression, we had then estimated the model here to be a unidimensional model, and it is no surprise that we still found it to be unidimensional. And of course, it could be operationalized as a 3-dimensional or even a 2-dimensional model. We were happy to test for a unidimensional model, and our data then confirmed this. But more interestingly, to that which we had sought to pursue with our aim, we found that latent class analysis demonstrates that in our data, there are indeed three groups. What is important here is that as much as you find the languishing, flourishing, and moderate mentally healthy groups, all three of them have a degree of reporting some symptoms of depression to various levels, as would be expected at the different levels of mental health, with the languishing ones having moderate depressive symptoms, the flourishing ones having much lower report of depressive symptoms, and the moderate mentally healthy ones having a higher level of depressive symptoms. Now, this then tells us a specific story and implications here. Primarily that there would be those groups that function at sub-clinical thresholds such that they would not necessarily be diagnosed with mental illness, or in this case, depression, and may even indeed show some indices of functioning in a mentally healthy manner. However, these could still be people who are to some degree vulnerable and at some risk of mental illness or less than optimal functioning. It is indeed these groups that can sometimes fall between the cracks if the rigidly known medical model that would simply be looking for mental illness does not also pay attention to the notion of prevention as well as mental health promotion. So indeed, we are now seeing the possible intertwine, the benefit of allowing or having the intertwined recognition of both mental health and mental illness among the same people. Now, for the incomplete thesis, whatever metaphor that you want to work with, whether it be a butterfly in the garden, as Mary Wissing calls it, or the waves, as Lomas have phrased it, or even a calabash, for that matter. Now, so as to allow for a free-flowing discussion, I wish to acknowledge the contributors at the beginning here already, and not necessarily at the end. Now, for the order of business, here's how I wish to pick out the argument. I will first begin by examining the propositions for the third wave of positive psychology and beyond. Second, I will determine the points of problematization for the application in an African context. Thirdly, I will explore the various angles and pieces of contribution to a possible solution. Fourthly, I will consider the contribution of relevance, or the relevance argument, and then propose a conversion point upon which we may then hope that we would have begun to speculate or come up with possible answers to these questions. About the third wave and beyond, and I use the propositions and observations of Wissing here. She observes that the post-dictionary trajectory of well-being studies is most likely. And what would this look like? it will be one where the boundaries are around the disciplines would become more permeable and more flexible and be more open to working in collaborative fashions with each other, where the human being is not necessarily centered, but the life of the rest of the ecological system, including the non-human life, also come to the fore. And we've seen all of this through interconnectedness relationships, which then would, of course, challenge how the philosophical thinking around these things have been packed. So the challenge to meta-theoretical assumptions, to conceptualizations, as well as methods. At the same time, Wissing, upon her observations, also raises concerns about there not necessarily, not at this point, being a strong overarching theory. And this speaks to philosophy, it speaks to the ontological assumptions. And a second concern being raised is that of the methodological approaches that may not necessarily be capable of capturing the complexity of what we may be studying. And then she proposes a unifying thesis, which she calls cohering harmony. And I make quite a long direct quotation from her paper, where she says, for the present purposes, cohering harmony and harmonization as well-being phenomenon and processes is defined as an in-between quality and dynamic of relatedness that evolve and change over time and context as meanings are made in ceaselessly changing relationships within and among people and between people and non-humans and ecological contexts expressed in virtuous behaviors and balancing of interests towards good of humans, non-humans, and nature. A very great deal of balance that she brings through here, as much as she also talks about and expresses concern about the complexities of balancing and harmonizing the interests of humans and non-human systems towards this goal of well-being that is all-encompassing and taking care of everybody and everything. So this is what has been expressed in this 2002, or rather 2022 paper on this post-disciplinary trajectory of well-being studies. Now, let us all think together about how this might find relevance and manifestation within an African context. How I wish to pick this is I go through some thoughts that I phrase as problems and some I phrase as solutions. They're not in any logical sequential thought, after which I will then go into the argument of relevance and arrive at a convergence point. So I raise some issues and I propose some solutions based on already existing literature. The first one is that positive psychology indeed seems to be an indigenous psychology. And this also makes us realize that, well, all psychologies are in fact indigenous because they are rooted in the reflective understandings of those who have invented them. Therefore, the need or the desire for universalization of this is indeed misguided. It is said to be steeped in Euro-American sociocultural context, and therefore the folk psychology of the middle class of Americans, right? Now, there is also a problem of a context-informed views and definitions of personhood. Now, I wish to argue that personhood is in fact the cask of cross-cultural differences, as this is how any society chooses to construct the human or the person, and therefore determining how the individual is bounded and relates to the rest of the world, with implications for behavior and other psychological outcomes. We can have two main opposite points, one being a self-construct that is characterized as a unitary being who is autonomous, who is self-determining, versus one who is more permeable, continuous, and connected with others. Now, the solution of a culturally competent positive psychology, what is rather more important here is the realization beyond just culture, whatever shape that takes, is the acknowledgement and realization that race and racism also plays, such that one then becomes aware of the dynamics of power and privilege that is brought by this in any intercultural interactions, and therefore begins to speak to power, to privilege, to value, to inequalities that more accurately describe the conditions of people's lives than the other more broad ideas of culture. Now, the problem of ignoring the unequal power results precisely from a lack of awareness of these dynamics, such that issues of race, poverty, and oppression, which are actually the material conditions of people, tend to be seen as less important or not recognized. And when we do this, we then tend to arrive at a position where the individual is then blamed for not having or not having exercised a sense of choice and free will, while the rest of the system is in itself structurally problematic. The solution of ecological embeddedness of well-being. Here we see well-being as a multidimensional dynamic and person or even culture-specific notion. Now, if we consider that societies ought to be ecocentric, we recognize that together with humans, there is also a greater socio-ecological system that in and of itself is important, but humans also rely on it, but that ought not to be the dominant purpose of our maintaining the well-being of the ecology. The problem of centering the human being, and this is also unfortunate that even though we recognize the importance of protecting the environment, promoting its well-being, and so on. Very often than not, it becomes as if all of this is done for the purposes of the ecosystem serving the human. The problem of the human-environment relationship boils down in our context to the whole issue of the use, ownership, and access to land. As long reminds us that to live with dignity, to establish bonds and kinship and community, to develop a sense of cultural and historical continuity, to live in a world with less anxiety and act upon it with renewed intensity. One needs to have this optimal access, connectivity, use, and ownership of land. The solution of multiple, mixed, and participatory methodologies. The complexity of a post-disciplinary well-being studies dispensation would then require methodological innovation, such that we have participants who are more than just passive respondents to our questions, but their involvement is more actively participatory. We have a combination of both bottom-up and top-down approaches. We have methodologies that are context respecting. The solution of relational-oriented to personhood, we all know that within an African context, both the individual and community are important. So the intra, the relational, and the ecocentric. At the same time, we recognize these three agencies: the spiritual agency, the social agency, and the self agency, where the self is the locus of agency and responsibility, and yet interconnected within the society and community, as well as with God, ancestors, divinities, and spirits. All right. Therefore, the shape of this personhood is one that is relationally orientated. Having said that, we wish to, make the following cautionary statements: that there is no single African culture, nor are they fixed and static, and how each individual engages or chooses to engage with it is, unique to their own choices. And there has also been fluidity and intermixing, as well as assimilation, as we are all members of the global world. The problem of interventions and practice, and this has been raised for over many years. In a recent book on quality of life by Dilov, Prof. Moller raises this observation that interventions do not always work. And according to her, it is because some of them tend to be insensitive to local customs, while those that would have been culturally respecting would work better. We are going to have serious problems about definitions and conceptual clarity. And now one needs to say here that we need to all be careful about falling into traps of lists and taxonomies, such that we need to aspire towards a unifying, coherent, abstract, theoretical, or conceptual point of convergence. And this is the point that Wissing also raises about the meta-theoretical assumptions, the ontologies, and the coherent point of our conceptual clarity. And this is in fact because, as Longhead also warned about, similarly to African psychology, that being over-inclusive means that you end up with a psychology of everything, which would essentially become a psychology of nothing. Those are my thoughts very quickly. Now let's pay attention to the idea of relevance. This is the recognition that the material concerns and circumstances of living of ordinary people matter. And these are also often shaped by the socio-economic and socio-political considerations in any world order. So for those in the knowledge generation fraternity, there will then be pressure to generate knowledge or science that has practical applications in response to this, and therefore also run the risk, unfortunately, of striving towards gaining political currency and legitimacy, which then juxtaposes or puts in opposite ends the democratic representation versus scientific credibility of that which comes out. In a paper where Long had looked at the addresses at SASA conferences, he then finds that there were two competing discourses, one about what he referred to as the market, and the other one is civic responsibility. I do not believe that any one of the two needs to be dominant over the other, but we can do both. As much as we may strive for international recognition, global competitiveness, and financial reward, we can simultaneously respond and give social justice, practical value and application, as well as respond to the violence experienced or seen by ordinary folk in South Africa and elsewhere. So he then makes a point, particularly about African psychology, that we need to move beyond pursuing cultural questions, as he phrases it, and therefore articulate the lived realities of ordinary South Africans, realities that are embedded in a landscape soaked in ableism, classism, gender-based violence, and radical racial discrimination. Having considered all of that, shall we then attempt a conversion point? Well, we will then arrive at expressing that well-being studies should therefore attempt or need to address the following concerns: interconnectedness and harmony, as well as higher level of integrated collaborations, especially across disciplines. Questions or issues of ontological and epistemological approaches, conceptual clarity and definitions, optimal practical applications and interventions, appropriate ways for contextualizing and embedding in appropriate or relevant situations the work that we do both at theoretical and application levels. Questions of social relevance, especially considering the social historical context and material conditions of ordinary people. And lastly, the optimal response to the often structural violence that people are faced with. So what may this interconnectedness proposed by Wissing, De La Fava, and others look like, and what are we then learning from this attempt at looking at all of this scholarship with particular relevance in Africa. The first point to make is that there has perhaps been an obsession with this cultural focus, which is primarily sociocentric and cosmocentric. That is very important, but it is only one part of the whole picture. The other part of the picture being the ecology, paying attention to the values of the ecocentric societies and paying attention to the non-human systems of our world and our planet. And lastly, probably more importantly, the issues of material conditions of people's lives and social justice, as Long has argued it as relevance. But and yet, many questions remain. So I imagine that recent future studies ought to then rethink and start contributing about disciplines, which disciplines are going to work how and collaborate in what fashions, what hierarchies are going to form, around what philosophical homes are they going to gather, etc. There are going to be issues or questions about, as well as innovations regarding methods and methodologies, ontologies, new definitions are more likely to emerge. And thank you very much. Thanks, Sheena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khumalo, for presenting and for sharing such contextually relevant research in this area. It was certainly quite thought-provoking. I'd like to now open up to my colleagues. I know you're also quite keen to interact with and engage with them. How I'd like for this to happen is if you could just raise your hand, and then when I acknowledge you, you can switch your mic on. So yeah, I'd like to hand over to colleagues for questions and comments. Leslie.
Hi, Itumeleng. Lovely to see you and to hear you. It's too long since we've been in the same physical space, but it's great to hear your voice. I have a sort of general question about this kind of approach that you and others take. My worry about I worry about things that try to explain everything, and so my question to you is, this is so comprehensive. What do you think your approach can't deal with? What's left out? And if everything is included, then I feel a little bit suspicious. Yeah, thanks, Itumeleng. Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, Proswaz. Yes, lovely seeing you at your university. I think the last time was at my former university. It's an important question, which of course I also raise in this presentation. Being aware of the danger of these taxonomies, of simply saying that what we are dealing with is multifaceted, is multidimensional, and then we come up with long lists of things that we need to do. I think that the diagram that I had at the end, which sort of brings together a context that is informed by culture in a sociocentric, cosmocentric fashion, and yet considers the conditions under which people live as much as the environment, which we have not paid much attention to. I mean, just as a sidetrack, I have at present a student who's asking people in Lesotho about what they think is well-being for them. And we were surprised that, while we expected a different kind of so-called African traditional explanation, people were talking about how they relate, never mind animals and that, but with the landscape, with the mountains and around themselves. And this speaks to this ecocentric society that we have often left out of our theorizing. I think that those three, which paint the context within which people's well-being becomes expressed, ought to be the cusp or the focal or the point of convergence.
Thanks very much. I always think when I hear people who are theoretically oriented that I tend to go in very small single syllables, small letters, but thank you for explaining it in a way that I can understand. Thanks so much. And great to see you. And thanks for the great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for that contribution. Would anyone else like to ask Dr. Khumalo a question or perhaps a comment?
Sheena, if there are no questions, are there other thoughts, are there comments?
Sure.
Maybe studying this or the other, or maybe sitting where they are. What is their contribution?
Absolutely. So anyone with perhaps similar research in the area and they would like to just share some thoughts? No. Okay. So I think we've really done good for time as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Khumalo, for presenting quite a substantive body of research, I think, in such a short amount of time as well. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, we all appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Keep well.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.